Economics is divided into two main branches, microeconomics and macroeconomics. Microeconomics deals with the behavior of individual economic units. These units include consumers, workers, investors, owners of land, business firms, in fact, any individual or entity that plays a role in the functioning of our economy. Microeconomics explains how and why these units make economic decisions. For example, it explains how consumers make purchasing decisions and how their choices are affected by changing prices and incomes. It also explains how firms decide how many workers to hire and how workers decide where to work and how much work to do. Another important concern of microeconomics is how economic units interact to form larger units, markets, and industries. Microeconomics helps us to understand, for example, why the American automobile industry developed the way it did and how producers and consumers interact in the market for automobiles. It explains how automobile prices are determined, how much automobile companies invest in new factories, and how many cars are produced each year. By studying the behavior and interaction of individual firms and consumers, microeconomics reveals how industries and markets operate and evolve, why they differ from one another, and how they are affected by government policies and global economic conditions. By contrast, macroeconomics deals with aggregate economic quantities, such as the level and growth rate of national output, interest rates, unemployment, and inflation. But the boundary between macroeconomics and microeconomics has become less and less distinct in recent years. The reason is that macroeconomics also involves the analysis of markets. For example, the aggregate markets for goods and services, labor, and corporate bonds. To understand how these aggregate markets operate, we must first understand the behavior of the firms, consumers, workers, and investors who constitute them. Thus, macroeconomists have become increasingly concerned with the microeconomic foundations of aggregate economic phenomena, and how much of macroeconomics is actually an extension of microeconomic analysis. The Rolling Stones once said, "You can't always get what you want." This is true. For most people, even Mick Jagger, there are limits to what you can have or do. It is a simple fact of life learned in early childhood. For economists, however, it can be an obsession. Much of microeconomics is about limits, the limited incomes that consumers can spend on goods and services, the limited budgets and technical know-how that firms can use to produce things, and the limited number of hours in a week that workers can allocate to labor or leisure. But microeconomics is also about ways to make the most of these limits. More precisely, it is about the allocation of scarce resources. For example, microeconomics explains how consumers can best allocate their limited incomes to the various goods and services available for purchase. It explains how workers can best allocate their time to labor instead of leisure, or to one job instead of another. And it explains how firms can best allocate limited financial resources to hiring additional workers versus buying new machinery, and to producing one set of products versus another. In a planned economy, such as that of Cuba, North Korea, or the former Soviet Union, these allocation decisions are made mostly by the government. Firms are told what and how much to produce and how to produce it. Workers have little flexibility in choice of jobs, hours worked, or even where they live. And consumers typically have a very limited set of goods to choose from. As a result, many of the tools and concepts of microeconomics are of limited relevance in those countries. In modern market economies, consumers, workers, and firms have much more flexibility and choice when it comes to allocating scarce resources. Microeconomics describes the trade-offs that consumers, workers, and firms face, and shows how these trade-offs are best made. The idea of making optimal trade-offs is an important theme in microeconomics, one that you will encounter throughout this book. Let's look at it in more detail. Consumers. Consumers have limited incomes, which can be spent on a wide variety of goods and services, or saved for the future. Consumer theory, the subject matter of chapters 3, 4, and 5 of this book, describe how consumers, based on their preferences, maximize their well-being by trading off the purchase of more of some goods with the purchase of less of others. We will also see how consumers decide how much of their incomes to save, thereby trading off current consumption for future consumption. Workers. Workers also face constraints and make trade-offs. First, people must decide whether and when to enter the workforce, because the kinds of jobs, and corresponding pay scales available to a worker depend in part on educational attachment and accumulated skills. One must trade off working now and earning an immediate income with continued education in the hope of earning a higher future income. Second, workers face trade-offs in their choice of employment. For example, while some people choose to work for large corporations that offer job security but limited potential for advancement, others prefer to work for small companies where there is more opportunity for advancement but less security. Finally, workers must sometimes decide how many hours per week they wish to work, thereby trading off labor for leisure. Firms also face limits in terms of the kinds of products that they can produce and the resources available to produce them. The Ford Motor Company, for example, is very good at producing cars and trucks, but it does not have the ability to produce airplanes, computers, or pharmaceuticals. It is also constrained in terms of financial resources and the current production capacity of its factories. Given these constraints, Ford must decide how many of each type of vehicle to produce. If it wants to produce a larger total number of cars and trucks next year or the year after, it must decide whether to hire more workers, build new factories, or do both. The theory of the firm, the subject matter of chapters 6 and 7, describes how these trade-offs can best be made. A second important theme of microeconomics is the role of prices. All of the trade-offs described above are based on the prices faced by consumers, workers, or firms. For example, a consumer trades off beef for chicken based partly on his or her preferences for each one, but also on their prices. Likewise, workers trade off labor for leisure based in part on the price that they can get for their labor, i.e. the wage. And firms decide whether to hire more workers or purchase more machines based in part on wage rates and machine prices. Microeconomics also describes how prices are determined. In a centrally planned economy, prices are set by the government. In a market economy, prices are determined by the interactions of consumers, workers, and firms. These interactions occur in markets, collections of buyers and sellers that together determine the price of a good. In the automobile market, for example, car prices are affected by competition among Ford, General Motors, Toyota, and other manufacturers, and also by the demands of consumers. The central role of markets is the third important theme of microeconomics. We will say more about the nature and operation of markets shortly.